diversity. So thank you for joining us today for this presentation and conversation. And I'm honored to introduce our speaker, Mr. Keith McIntosh. Keith is here to talk with us about an inclusive discussion group, intersections that he initiated at the University of Richmond, that I think provides a model for building greater understanding by confronting head-on the issues that normally divide us. Keith is the Vice President for Information Services and Chief Information Officer at the University of Richmond. Prior to joining the University of Richmond, he was the CIO at Ithaca College, the CIO at Pima County Community College District, and he also held progressively more responsible leadership and management positions within IT during his distinguished 24-and-a-half-year service in the United States Air Force, including a combat tour in Northern Iraq. Keith is an accomplished and sought-after speaker and author. He has written and spoken extensively about diversity, equity, and inclusion. He's the first CIO to be selected to serve on the board for the National Association of College and University Business Officers with a 3-year term beginning in August 2016. He was reappointed for a second term to the association's board and serves on their executive governance committee. His peers nominated and elected him to serve on the EDUCAUSE board for a 4-year term starting on October 30th, 2017. He serves as treasurer of the EDUCAUSE board and also serves on the leadership board for CIOs. Keith served on the 2018 EDUCAUSE Task Force on Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, which put forth 10 recommendations to EDUCAUSE leadership that elevate attention to DEI as a critical and strategic issue. He was the inaugural recipient of the EDUCAUSE Rising Star Award in 2011. The governor of Virginia appointed Keith to serve on the Virginia War Memorial Board in July 2017. Keith graduated summa cum laude from Trident University International with an MBA in Information Technology Management and a BS in Management Information Systems from Bellevue University. I've known Keith for 8 years, since we both participated in the 2012 class of the Leading Change Institute. The Leading Change Institute is designed for leaders in higher education, including CIOs, librarians, information technology professionals, and administrators who are interested in working collaboratively to promote and initiate change on critical issues affecting higher education. This group has been holding weekly conversations during the pandemic for all Institute participants from the past 20 years as a forum for sharing experiences and strategies. At one of these recent meetings where we were discussing the Black Lives Matter movement, the recent murders and other violence perpetrated against people of color, and what was happening at our institution's response, Keith shared a bit about intersections, the topic of today's presentation. While the meeting was still going on, I reached out on email and asked him if he would speak to us here at FAU, and he generously agreed. And thanks to this technology, we've been able to open this conversation up, and we now have 118 registered participants from around North America. So one of the reasons that I find Keith to be so successful professionally is because of the person that he is. Those of you who know him know that he's funny, generous, compassionate, insightful, incredibly dedicated. So Keith is going to speak for about 50 minutes and then open it up to questions and conversation. So as you think of things during the course of his presentation, type it into the chat box and our session's moderator will share those questions with Keith. So now, without further ado, I'm going to turn the platform over to Keith.
Well, thank you, Carol. I really appreciate my friend Carol Hickson for the invitation to speak with you today and for that lovely introduction. Sometimes when I think about introductions, I was like, that's too doggone long. We have to shorten that up for the future. I want to say thank you to all the registrants in attendance for taking time out of your busy schedule to attend today's conversation, and I would like that to be a conversation. I want to give a shout out to some of our University of Richmond colleagues and some of the Leading Change Institute colleagues that Carol mentioned. If they're viewing, and just want to say hi to them. I also know a little bit about FAU, not a lot, but a little bit. I want to applaud what you guys have done at FAU with your Erase the Hate initiative. I'm really intrigued by that. And as Carol said, I discussed, me sharing the journey that we've been on at the University of Richmond. And so what I try to do today is just kind of walk you through the inception and what's happened by each year from 2017 up to 2020. And then we'll open it up for whatever questions you may have. I'm very fortunate to serve as the Chief Information Officer at the University of Richmond. And I should say a little bit about the university before we get started. Okay, there we go. I was having a little delay in my technology. The University of Richmond is a top 25 liberal arts university. We have approximately 3,000 undergraduates and 1,000 graduate students. We are divided into 5 schools. Our largest school is the School of Arts and Sciences. We also have a top-ranked business school. We have a highly respected law school, and we have the nation's first school for leadership studies. And we also have a community-focused school of professional and continuing studies. Now, the University of Richmond is committed to building a thriving, inclusive, diverse, and equitable community. We call that TIDE here at the University of Richmond. And also, it would be remiss if I didn't say we are the spiders. We are the only university with a spider mascot. Now, I started working at the University of Richmond in August 1st, 2016. And as Carol mentioned in my background, some things about me, I want to share some other things about me, just so you kind of understand why I am interested in this topic and why I'm so passionate about it. As long as I can remember, I've been an advocate for DEI, for diversity, equity, inclusion. I think I actually was doing this well before I even know what DEI was. Looking back at my life as a kid, I was mindful of those who were excluded or those who needed support or needed an ally, and I always felt like my heart went out to those folks, and I was always trying to bring them into the circle, whatever the circle was. Part of that might be because my dad served in the Air Force for 30 years, and we lived in various parts of the world and across the United States. So I grew up attending multiple grade schools, multiple middle schools, and multiple high schools, and each of those times when you would transition and move, you're othered really quickly. You have to learn how to connect with people and understand the dynamics of the new situation where you're at. And so I gained appreciation of diversity through my life experiences. I also, I'm a fun-loving guy. I love people. You can ask my wife. It pains me to see when other people are marginalized, and so that's another reason why I'm a big, strong advocate for DEI. My belief is that there is strength in teams, and when I say strength in teams, there's strength in the diversity of the teams and in having diverse individuals on your team. My leadership style, which I try to practice inclusionary or inclusive leadership coupled with situational leadership. And lastly, before we dive into the journey, I'd like to say that I believe strongly as a leader that DEI is just as important as strategy, budget, and operations. So for me, it's not something that sits to the side. It's something that sits as core to how I lead and how I manage and how I interact with folks. So today I'll share a little bit of our cultural conversation journey year by year at the University of Richmond. So just over a year ago, a year after I started, I should say, I started on August 1st, 2016, and then a year later we witnessed some very traumatic events. The Unite the Right rally was held in Charlottesville, Virginia. Charlottesville sits about 65 miles west of the University of Richmond. It's about an hour drive. Maybe not for me, it might be a little bit faster if you ask my wife. But when white supremacists, neo-Nazis, and the alt-right faced counter-protesters, we witnessed some really horrific acts of violence. Some of them turned deadly. If you recall, this included Heather Heyer, who was killed by a motorist who drove his car into the crowd of counter-protesters. These events took place on Friday, August 11th and Saturday, August 12th, 2017. When my staff came to work the following Monday, it was all anyone could talk about, as it should be. It was just kind of almost in our backyard. And my assistant, Melody, shared this with me, and that's when I decided to convene a meeting during lunch for us to discuss what we just witnessed. So I have to give a shout out to somebody before we get started, because as much as I'd like to think that this was my idea, I patterned what we were doing off a weekly racism conversation of a similar conversation that were held at Ithaca College, where I was at prior to coming to the University of Richmond. At the time that I was there, I was working for a gentleman, Mr. Gerald Hector. He's now he was the CFO there. He's now the CFO at Morehouse College. We were having some challenges on our campus with race and race relations and racial incidents, particularly with our student body, and he launched a conversation similar to this. And so I attended those and participated in those, and I found that those were valuable, so that's what I wanted to introduce here. When we first met here at the University of Richmond, during our first meeting, we spent this first meeting as the person facilitated. I felt like it was important to kind of get us grounded on how we were going to interact before we dived into topics. And we decided as a group, not my decision, a group decision, to limit attendance to just my division. So I had that convening authority, said, hey, I can call a meeting for information services. And we wanted to have it as a closed group to begin with because there were concerns about maybe privacy, trust, and familiarity, and those types of things led itself to let's have a conversation within our own division. We felt that the subject matter would be very sensitive and very uncomfortable for folks. And a little bit about my division. So I have about 74 positions in my division, and attendance has always been optional. I've never made attendance mandatory. And we typically have around 15 to 20 people that come and attend the meetings. Now, we set this up. I purposely wanted to be set up to pick a specific day and a specific location and a specific time. So we meet every Wednesday from noon to 1 in a building right across the way, about 5 minutes away from my office, called the Whitehurst Living Room. Now, we've had to cancel a few times. We've had to reschedule, but for the most part, we've been meeting very consistently since August 2017. The first thing we did in our first meeting after we kind of went through what we wanted from being open or closed was we developed our rules of engagement. I felt it was very important, so we make sure that we're bound or guided by these rules. Starting off with, and you see them listed here, but I'm going to kind of walk through them. Vegas rules seem self-explanatory, but really what we're saying is, folks might reveal or share things here that they may not want told outside of the room that we're speaking in because it could be taken out of context. And it's not my right or responsibility to take somebody else's story that they shared in private in a small group and share it outside. Respect everyone. I'm a big fan and I'm a strong proponent of let's interrogate the topic, but let's not attack the individual, right? And I'm going to talk a little bit about that a little bit later. Also reserve judgment. A lot of times, myself included, when we hear something, our mind starts working and making judgments about what we heard. And a lot of times, it could be misdiagnosed. So do your best to reserve judgment. Wait till you hear everything out and listen. And that brings us to listen to understand and not to respond. I don't know about you, but oftentimes you're in a meeting or you're with groups of people, you hear something, and you're already forming a response halfway through the delivery of what they're having to say, and then you kind of shut off what you're hearing in the last part of their conversation. So we were really thinking, let's listen to understand, not to respond. The other thing we want, we have, especially in IT, I'm an extreme extrovert, but not, a lot of folks in IT are not. They're introverts. Some folks want to share their thoughts out loud while they're talking. Others would like to process, and they might need a little time before they're ready to respond. So we wanted to make sure that folks were able to share their thoughts without people interjecting their thoughts on top of it. We really wanted to make sure this was a dialogue, so allow for and ask questions. Nothing was really off the table there. We wanted to make sure that, we stayed professional, but ask. That's how we'll learn from one another. But we knew that sometimes things might come up and might be a little too pressing or too emotional or too much for somebody to handle, so we wanted to come up with a way for us to let the room know without being offensive to anybody. So we had come up with, let's make sure we use I and me statements. So for example, I found that last conversation to be a little too much for me. I'd like to, if we could, stay away from that topic, something to that effect. And then crawl, walk, run. And what we mean there is, and this is important just in general, but definitely for our conversations, that folks, this, to me, DEI is a journey, and you're going to hear me say the word journey quite a bit. It's not a destination. You never arrive. As much as I've been steep in speaking about this topic or writing about this topic or being on panels about this topic, I still have a lot to learn. So I'm on a journey, and I know that there are folks who are just at the crawl stage. They're just getting started, and you have people who are now walking, but they're not walking briskly. You have people that are speed walkers, then you have people that are full-out sprinters or joggers, right? And we want to make sure that when you're having a conversation, be mindful of the fact that not everybody's going to be in the same space as you are. So crawl, walk, run. Once we codified our rules of engagement, each of us answered 2 questions. What are the highest hopes for the outcome of these conversations? And what is your most realistic expectations? Then we moved into having a conversation and sharing our thoughts and feelings about Charlottesville. Now, it's important because, as I'm going to say this now, it was important to we codified the rules of engagement. We put them on like a poster board, and we put them inside the room, and they hang there every time we meet. And it's important to readdress and come back to those just to remind folks, because when you open up the group, you have people come and go. And I think it's helpful to let everybody know at the beginning of a meeting that there are rules of engagement, something gentle. So in 2017, our humble beginnings, we as Carol said before, we started very organically. This Melody came in, and her office is right across the hall. She said, Mac, this is happening. I said, yeah, let's have a conversation, and we set it up 2 weeks later. The topics and speakers were basically chosen by me primarily. I did get some input and requests from some of the attendees. I wasn't sure who was going to attend from my team or what the level of interest was. Folks would attend, but they wouldn't share anything. And so as a facilitator, I think I was doing a poor job because I should be trying to draw folks out, but I found I was doing most of the talking. I allowed this for a while because I really wanted folks to get comfortable coming. I didn't want people to feel like they were having to be forced to talk and then be out of their comfort zone so far that they wouldn't want to come back. But one of the things we started to do was we invited our first faculty member, Dr. Laurinette Lee, fantastic individual, historian. She works in our building upstairs, and she spoke to us in September about intersectionality. And that was a really, I could see that conversation really kind of got us, we were starting to get a little warm to the conversation about talking about topics, and people were asking really good questions. As we moved into October, we were thinking about maybe we should read a book, and I'm going to talk a little more about that in a moment. Then we invited another faculty member, Dr. Thad Williams. He's also a UR faculty member upstairs, and he spoke to us, and we had another fantastic conversation. So back to the book, I was thinking about how the conversations had gone, and I said, hey, let's think about a book we can read. And we asked the attendees what books would they recommend, and then we voted on which one we would read. One of my staff, Althea, recommended the book that I'm going to share with you here in a moment after hearing her keynote, the author's keynote at a local Women in IT conference. We chose to read Overcoming Bias, Building Authentic Relationships Across Differences by Dr. Tiffany Jana. Now, we had found from August to about October that the introspective reflection, when we were trying to get people to, share stories from their personal life, that was very challenging, and it actually made people super uncomfortable. The book was a way for us to help people be more comfortable, because now they could take their focus off themselves and focus on the chapter and the information in the chapter. We chose this book, in addition to being a local author, we chose it because it was short. It had 144 pages. It was easy, but a very powerful read. It focused on what we could do to better ourselves as individuals, and it actually included exercises and activities designed to help you navigate bias and increase your fluency on the topic. We were very fortunate, since she was a local author, that we invited the author to come speak with our group, and you see her pictured here. It just so happens, in the conversation, I did not know this until both Dr. Crutcher, our president, Dr. Ronald Crutcher, his wife, Dr. Betty Neal Crutcher, and Dr. Tiffany Jana were in the same room. She told me that she spoke German fluently, and I knew that Dr. Crutcher also spoke German, so it was very interesting to see two African Americans who just met just have a fantastic conversation in German. You just never know and I think about diversity. You could look at people and not know everything about a person. I would highly recommend this book. This was a big starting point for us, and I think this is when our conversations took off. This is when the person who volunteered to take the first chapter was somebody I was not expecting on our team. It's a very quiet, professional, hardworking, behind-the-scenes, soft-spoken person who just handles all our financial transactions. And she did such a beautiful, fantastic job, and it just blew me away. And that's when I knew we were on our way. Along the way, in preparation for this talk, I thought maybe I should reach out to some of the individuals and bring their perspectives in, so you're not just hearing from me. Now, I will say I brought this up too late. I brought it up on Friday as we were going into the holiday break, so a lot of folks, I got a lot of out-of-office replies, so nobody's seen my email. But the few that did respond, I've included their responses, and I'm going to share those with you now. So while you're reading these, it was interesting because as first off, Melody. Melody is my assistant, and I'm going to brag on her a little bit. If she was here, she'd be embarrassed, but that's what I do. She has been very instrumental. She's been with this conversation from minute one. If you recall, as I was saying in my opening, the reason why I was compelled to start the conversation is because she came to me and told me what was happening within our division. And she's been instrumental in starting our conversation, but she also is very, very important to the sustaining of the conversation, because when I think about the logistics of what it takes to make sure we schedule the meetings and have the location and send out the topics to folks and schedule the speakers and who's facilitating and put a box folder together, she does all of that, and she does it fantastically well. And she also deeply enriches the conversation with her comments and her questions. Also, Rhett was also with us from the beginning. Rhett is one of my team members on the Information Services Division. And in addition to, he told me, he said, in addition to opening my eyes to my own unconscious biases and making me aware that by race alone, I am privileged. This group has educated me regarding other cultures and races and religions and genders. Attending this group has made me a better person. And we also invited folks from outside, and you see comments here from Monica and Cynthia. Now, while we started slowly, and I would kind of say we started awkwardly, we learned a lot of what we can improve moving forward. So when we went into our pace in 2017 was quick. It was almost too quick. And if you recall, we were having topics every week. We found that discussing critical topics or issues in 1 hour and then moving on to another topic the next week just wasn't effective, because you really can't learn anything. And the conversations felt extremely rushed. We always ended up our sessions wanting or needing more to discuss the topic deeper at the end. And actually, we'd often run over time. We were scheduled to go 12 to 1, but we found ourselves still sitting in the room at 1:30 because we just had so much we wanted to get off our chest or we wanted to ask or interrogate about the topic. Now, again, while I was facilitating each discussion, I was facilitating each discussion while doing most of the talking. We learned that we needed to spend more time than a week on a topic to truly unpack it. So when we started the next year, 2018, which is our first full year as Intersections, we decided to start off with a planning session. In our divisional conference room, we brought all those who had participated in and said, hey, what do you want to talk about in 2018? So once we had that, we ordered lunch for them, and we also decided we were going to move from weekly to monthly topics, and then a monthly topic or a theme. This would typically give us about 4 to 5 weeks on a theme-based discussion to help us really unpack a topic deeply. And at my urging, I recommended that we have participants volunteer to facilitate discussions. There would be no more MAC having to do all the talking and everybody else is sitting there listening. So once we got past that, that was when we really started to have a lot more interaction amongst folks. We invited faculty to share information. We started watching films and documentary. We started to read our second book, more on that in a moment. We also discussed topics beyond race and racism, and that's where we have been ever since. We pretty much think about all isms get discussed inside Intersections. I was starting to get inquiries at this time, though, from non-division staff about attending. I guess the word had gotten out. Folks in my division who had attended these meetings might go back, and as you know, on a campus community, people, we know folks all across the campus. And so once somebody from my team shared with somebody else that this was what's happening, they were like, well, can we come? And I wanted to make sure that we agreed on this as a group. So it was 6 months in. I asked my division, and they were like, we're not quite ready to invite others to join us. So they said no. So now, the University of Richmond celebrates fostering important and challenging dialogues through this speaker series, which we call the Sharp Viewpoint Speaker Series. And our 2018 lineup looks like this. Our president, Dr. Ronald Crutcher, invited prominent thought leaders to our campus annually to discuss critical issues. And in 2018, he brought in Jonathan Haidt, a social psychologist, researcher, and author of The Coddling of the American Mind. He also brought in Dr. Beverly Daniel Tatum, president emeritus of Spelman College, and author of Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in a Cafeteria. He brought in Robert Zimmer, president of the University of Chicago, and author of Essential Results of Functional Analysis. And lastly, he brought in Paula Krebs, executive director of Modern Language and former Dean of Humanities and Social Sciences at Bridgewater State University. But I want to kind of highlight Dr. Tatum. We chose, once we saw the lineup that she was going to be coming to our campus, we chose to read her book. More on that later. We watched our first film. Some of you may be familiar with the movie Crash. It was released in 2004. It portrays bigotry and xenophobia within interconnected lives. We watched it as a group in one of our theater-style classrooms, and then we convened a talk-back session the following 2 weeks. We found, and that's something we've consistently done since this first film and every film after that, is it takes about, if you watch the film, one session, and then we don't really have, we might have a little bit of a discussion, but most of the time we break at the end of that film once the film concludes. Then the next session, the next two sessions, we come with our thoughts. And I think that's been instrumental because it allows those folks who need time to process and think and write their thoughts down to come back and actually have a fully engaged conversation. We found that the film, for us, really spurred deeper conversations. And then that's one of the first times I felt folks were starting to share personal stories. You know, when we started, those weren't coming out of folks. But after we started watching this film and some of the things we saw in the film actually had folks sharing personal stories. But back to Dr. Tatum. So around this time, it was August of 2018, we decided to, you know, I went back to my group and said, hey, can we open it up? And they said, yep. So we finally did. And we started reading Dr. Tatum's book. Now, a few others from other divisions and other areas on campus started joining us for discussions regularly at this time. I should say staff joined us. And we read her and discussed her book from August to December. And unlike the first book, this book is very dense and it takes time. It feels like reading a manual, but it's such a good book. And it's definitely something that, you know, I have it on my desk here, if I can pull this up. And it's something I think if you really are ready to get into a deep conversation, this is a good book to start reading. I told her I had the opportunity, and so you see this quick selfie that I took with her. I basically accosted her because I was going to a conference for NACUBO, the Higher Education Accounting Forum, and I was sitting off to the side, and I did not know that she was going to be a speaker or the keynote for the conference. And we had just had a conversation about her, and we just chose this book, so her face and was just fresh in my mind. And I see this lady come out of the ladies' room, and I said, well, wait a minute, don't accost her when she comes right out of the ladies' room. Let's give her a moment. So she walked across from the ladies' room, crossed the hallway, and walked around in front of me, and that's when I reached out to her, introduced myself, and told her who I was. And I said, hey, you know, we're reading your book. You're coming to our campus, and I'd love if you do get a chance while you're here, maybe it'd be great if you could address and speak with Intersections. So, you know, she did come, and she did come spend time with Intersections. She actually set up afternoon tea, and our team was able to ask her a lot of questions. And by the time we met with her, we'd only gone through Chapter 7 of her book. And I will say I was so looking forward to the visit from her, but I couldn't attend, but the rest of Intersections was because I had to go to a conference. I'm still a little, that still hurts me, but I'm so happy for the rest of the team. But so now I'm looking at, here we started very informally. We've read 2 books, and we've been able to speak with both authors. That's been fantastic. But an interesting thing happened along the way. One of my staff, who's a white male, was facilitating a discussion on Chapter 5, Racial Identity and Adulthood. And on this day, I was 15 minutes late to Intersection. And there was no other people of color in attendance at the time. And as I walked in, I was walking in with one of our black female colleagues. And when we walked in, we noticed that it seemed like the conversation wasn't really happening. 15 minutes in, there would be a dialogue. And what I was finding out, it was difficult to facilitate this conversation, which started with, the topic at the time was making a compelling case for black student enrollment at historically black colleges. And this is a comment I asked him today, and he sent me this quote. And it was something I know that they had a conversation with Dr. Tatum about, that folks, although we had been on this journey for almost a year, folks were still, you know, could be made to feel real uncomfortable. But we learned a lot through that process. And so I asked another question to attendees, like, what have you learned or gained by participating? And Allison is one of the first to join when we opened up the group outside of my division. And she has been a steadfast member and contributor. She led our discussion today, matter of fact, on LGBTQIA+ violence. Hillary is someone I believe will someday become a chief diversity officer, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about her later. I would be remiss if I didn't mention our First Lady, Dr. Betty Neal Crutcher, who's our university president's spouse and cross-cultural mentor. I know she keeps a busy schedule, but she comes as much as she possibly can, and when she does, her voice and contributions have been invaluable. And then, of course, we have our police captain, Eric Beatty, and he always is very, how do I want to say, he asks some of the best questions, not just for him, but I think it helps inform others. But here we are, we've completed our first full year, and now we have a model to follow for our next year. So we go into our next year, and I should say, as I was putting together this presentation, I really had not thought about all the things we had accomplished and all the things we've been involved with. But looking back as I prepared, I realized we tackled a lot of conversations in 2019. This was also the year that other discussion groups formed on campus, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that in a minute. Here is a sample of our discussions. We started 2019 by revisiting Charlottesville, because if you recall, when we first talked about Charlottesville, it was at the very forming stage. We did less than an hour session, and we really didn't tackle that closely. I think we had built our confidence and we built our ability to have a conversation. So we decided as we were planning on 2019, that we were going to start off revisiting Charlottesville, and two staff from my division led us through a discussion for the first 2 weeks of the year. Then following that week, we were very fortunate to invite an official from Charlottesville to speak with us. So this is Tyson Moore. He is not the official from Charlottesville. He's my barber. Now, I should say he was my barber, especially since, well, let's not go there. I will say that once COVID hit and I couldn't go to a barbershop, I found my hair, the little bit I could grow, was not growing out the way I like it, so I took matters in my own hand. Now he and I have similar hairdos, let's say that much. Tyson Moore is a native of Richmond, Virginia. He served 8 years in the United States Army Reserves, and he's a graduate of Virginia State University. He earned an undergraduate degree in Information Systems and Decision Sciences and a master's degree in economics. He's also a certified personal trainer. So why am I sharing this information about my barber? Great question. He and I have a lot in common. We're both veterans. We both have IT degrees and worked in the IT profession. He was a certified personal trainer. I was a certified personal trainer. So as luck have it, you know, we really hit it off when I'd sit in the chair. And if anybody's gone to a barbershop, you know, you have some really great conversations. And he and I would just have this string of conversation for years. And so he's kind of been on the intersections journey since day one as well. And I told him one time sitting in his chair, I said, hey, Tyson, we're getting ready to revisit Charlottesville. And he says, you know what? I know somebody that might be a speaker that you would want to have come speak to your group. I said, really, who? He says, my auntie. I said, really? He said, yes. This is Dr. Rosa Atkins, Tyson's aunt. She happens to be the superintendent of Charlottesville City Schools. While we were sitting in the chair, Tyson texted her. She texted back. We exchanged phone numbers. We set up a date and time for us to have a conversation. When I was in my office, we spoke. I explained intersections. She said she'd be happy to do so, and we were on our way. And that was a fantastic conversation. And she shared, you know, the perspective. It was very unique because as superintendent, she had the elementary school, the middle schools, and the high school. She had to work with principals, teachers, students, and parents as they had to deal with the onslaught of outsiders coming to Charlottesville, all the disruptive stuff that happened in Charlottesville, and then the things that happened, you know, the mental health that happened afterwards for all that's under her responsibility. She also talked about her work with the FBI. And then she shared information about the history of Charlottesville, which was illuminating. There was just a lot of things, a lot of injustices happened in Charlottesville with people of color. And so you just never know where your next opportunity to have a speaker will come from. And due to the level of interest with intersections, as you recall, folks kept asking me, Matt, can you lead another conversation on another day? It was happening quite often. I had personally said I could commit to doing Wednesday from noon to 1, but we had folks who were saying, could you do something on Monday at 8, or could you do something at Wednesday at, you know, at 5 p.m. or Friday at 5 p.m. And I had to say no. As much as I like to say yes to everything, you ask my wife about that, I overcommit. I had to say no to that because I couldn't do it. But I said we could do something where we could kind of share with our campus community where they could learn what they wanted to do and from us. So we put together a panel, and we included members from the information services staff, and then we had folks that were outside of my division who had joined us later. We had about 40, 50 people from the campus that attended. And this is at the moment, at this time, around this time frame, we finally had opened up to start inviting faculty to participate as part of our discussion. One of the staff that was in the audience that day asked if we could include students in our discussion, and we said sure. So later in July of 2019, we included students in our conversation for the first time. Up until this, we did not have any formal web presence. Everything about what we did was kind of word of mouth. And then once you came, we could put you on a distribution list of email, and we didn't have any advertising to speak of. But now, starting in July of 2019, we started advertising in our daily university email, which we call Spider Bites. And I'm going to talk a little more about one person who attended that day later in my presentation. We watched 2 documentary films. We had selected this documentary film after reading Chapter 8 of Dr. Tatum's book, which focused on critical issues in Latino, American Indian, and Asian Pacific American identity development. We, individually and collectively, realized we knew very little about the Native American experience. So this documentary film, which is available to purchase or stream, Dawnland, is the untold story of indigenous child removal in the United States through the nation's first ever government-endorsed Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which investigated the devastating impact of Maine's child welfare practices on the Wabanaki people. They were forced to assimilate into white society. Children were ripped away from their families, deprived of their culture, and erased their identities. And for the conversation, we decided to institute listening circles for our talk back. And it was the first time we'd done it. I have a talking stick here. And basically what we'd say, we would sit in other time. We set up our room, kind of a living room lounge. It's kind of already in a circle, so there are chairs, rocking chairs, sofas. But we set up this circle, and the communication flow was going to be different. In the tradition of Native Americans, I would ask a question, and I'd have the talking stick, and I'd pass it to my left. Every person who received a talking stick had 1 or 2 things they could do. They could say, I pass, and pass the stick to the next person, or they could respond directly to the question. They could not respond to conversations or responses from other folks. They had to answer the question that was posed, and they had a limited time to get their responses in. And we found that really worked well because it allowed folks to, sometimes when you have conversations, you've been in a room, there are some people that can dominate a conversation. I've probably been accused of that myself. So this allowed everybody to really kind of gather their thoughts and think about what they wanted to say, and they could choose to say something or choose not to. And we found that worked really well. We also researched, because of this chapter, and discussed information about Native American tribes in Richmond, specifically where UR sits, namely the Monacan and Powhatan tribe. And it just so happens, if you are interested, this Melody sent this to me yesterday, there's going to be a free screening of both that film and Dear Georgina as a double feature tonight at 7 p.m. And you can look at that tiny URL there. I'll make sure we get that link to you afterwards. And our second film, another documentary film we watched, was available, which is available right now on Netflix to stream. It's from the filmmaker Ava DuVernay. She explores the history of racial inequality in the United States. This film particularly focused on the fact that the nation's prisons are disproportionately filled with African Americans. Now, sometimes our topics, and in this next case, the medium, can come from non-traditional opportunities. So in November of 2019, I had the opportunity to attend a student performance under the direction of Professor Chuck Mike. That's him in the upper right-hand corner. Hope that shows up right on your screen. I was moved by what I witnessed, and I thought it would be great to have them deliver that same performance to Intersection. So Mr. Chuck Mike is an associate professor of theater, and he's also an internationally acclaimed director. I asked the students, and I asked Chuck, would they mind, and they said absolutely. So once we coordinated date and time, we brought their Theater for Social Change, Class of Fall of 19, to Intersections, where they explored real-life stories of racial and cultural segregation at the University of Richmond. The performance included 6 students: Mir Satan, Emma Kennedy, Johnette Johnson, Mackie Marino, Miguel Shaw, and Tyreek Funderburg. Under Chuck's direction, they tackled how deep is the issue of segregation at the University of Richmond. Now, these students acted out 6 stories to bring real life before our eyes. That they dealt with segregation and racial issues in the classroom, things that are happening in the dormitory, things that are happening in the dining facilities, things that happen in fraternities and sororities, just to name a few. These are current students talking about current issues. And because this was a special convening of intersections, I put an invite out to the senior leadership on campus, and many of them attended, and it was well worth their while. And I think the students were deeply appreciative because they had an opportunity to deliver their performance directly to senior administration. Our 2019 book was What If I Say the Wrong Thing? 20 Habits for Culturally Effective People. This is another short, easy read. It was only 125 pages. It provides practical strategies and suggestions. She provides a right mix of data and stories that help illustrate her points to each of the 25 habits. There are some on campus that are starting to read this book, and that's what they're starting with versus the one we started with. You can pick it. I have a preference for overcoming bias first and then maybe moving into this one second. But she helps the reader become more culturally effective in their personal and professional life. Now, the 2019 Sharp Speaker Series, Dr. Crutcher invited another distinguished panel of folks in. And this year, we're going to be focusing on 2019, we're focusing on identity development, gender, race, faith, and political ideology. And here's the lineup for 2019. We were very fortunate. I had the opportunity to meet Michelle Norris in 2017 at the NACUBO Annual Conference, and as it was, they invited me to go to lunch with her with several other folks. And so when I got to the room, I was just milling around. There was like 3 or 4 round tables, and I sat at a table. I sat early, and then guess who sits to the left of me? Michelle Norris. So she sits next to me, and of course, being the extroverted self I am, I started chatting her up, and I told her about intersection. And I said, hey, I'd love you to come to the University of Richmond one day, and maybe we can, have something happen there. And I also told her about EDUCAUSE, which is my association. And so I immediately told the EDUCAUSE staff, and they were able to get her as a keynote keynote speaker for 2018. And then I recommended her as a speaker for this Sharp series. So I was so pleased to see that she was coming to the University of Richmond. So Michelle, if you don't know, is one of the most trusted voices in American journalism. From 2002 to 2011, she was a co-host of NPR's evening news program, All Things Considered. Michelle Norris started the Race Card Project in 2010 after the publication of her family memoir, The Grace of Silence. Also a good book. I encourage you to read that. The project is designed to foster a wider conversation about race in America. What she does is she invites people to share their thoughts on the word race in only 6 words. I repeat, only 6 words. Sounds challenging, but it is doable. She visited the University of Richmond late last year and discussed how she turned the pejorative phrase, race card, into a productive dialogue on a difficult topic. And she also facilitated a race card project at the University of Richmond, and several members of Intersections were selected to participate. And later that evening, I was very fortunate to be asked by our president, Dr. Crutcher, to introduce her to the community before her talk and to sit down and interview her and ask her questions. I was very pleased to see that several members of Intersections were given the first opportunity to pose questions from the audience. And speaking about the race card, just so you can kind of get what it might look like, here's mine. White stepson, black son, multiracial daughter. And then I've been able to add a backstory. She has collected over 500,000 personal narratives. They have collected them from all 50 states and 96 countries. She's now including backstories, as I just said, and photos to help explain further. And I said earlier that 2019 was a pivotal year. It really was, because Intersections is spurring other discussion groups to form. The Office of Common Ground launched the White Anti-Racism Lunchtime Discussion Series in September of last year. They typically meet on Mondays from noon to 1. This lunchtime series is open to any member of the campus community interested in developing a better understanding of what whiteness is or its relationship to racism and implications for being anti-racist. They only ask that all participants keep the discussion centered on whiteness and anti-racism. Now, I think it's important, I purposely picked Wednesday, and I think the first time they had their meeting, they put their meeting on Wednesday, and I felt, whoa, wait a minute, we have dibs on Wednesday. Just kidding. But really, these conversations are so critical, we don't need to compete at the same time, so I encourage them to pick another day, and they picked Monday, which was fantastic. Actually, my assistant Melody reached out to the assistant in Common Ground, and they were able to work that out. Another discussion group formed pattern after intersections. And I'm going to talk and I'm going to brag a little bit about this for a minute. They may be attending, so I hope they're not blushing. You remember the panel discussion I was telling you about? One of the attendees was Hillary Appleton, and she was inspired to start a group after attending our panel discussion. In her words, she said she left the panel discussion fired up. She knew her division, University Advancement, could really benefit from such a group. And when she got done, she emailed my assistant, Melody, for advice, and Melody connected me with Hillary. And then I think she was a little shocked that I asked to meet with her so soon. And we met that following week. I shared our meeting structure, our topic history, our recommended reading, our rules of engagement, and I gave her some advice and asked her a lot of her questions. I encouraged her to speak with her VP to make sure she was on board with it, which she was. She gave an enthusiastic thumbs up to that. And then she set about identifying a co-facilitator, and that's something I would highly encourage you to think about. I have a lot of energy in this space, and I feel comfortable facilitating conversation, but it can be challenging for one person. So I'd encourage you, if you're going to start, try to maybe have co-facilitators. And she picked Emily Saunders, and both these two ladies have been fantastic, and they've invited me twice to come speak to their sessions. I can't speak highly enough of both of them. I will say it was very important that they decided to go get training on how to do facilitation. There was a local resource in Richmond that they attended, and I think that was very beneficial to them. So I asked folks what's been the most challenging part of participating in these sections, and I'll leave this up here for you to read. I guess I can highlight the creamers because Kevin, who works in my division, and his wife Jean are both UR alums. They met here as students, and Kevin has been consistently attending, and when we open up to outsiders as much as her schedule permits, Jean has been attending as well. I was just on a call with them. We had our intersections this afternoon, and they were both there. Fantastic individuals, ask some of the best questions, and share. They're very vulnerable, and that's what I appreciate about them. They're very vulnerable, and they share things that help us understand the struggle that they're wrestling with, which helps us all understand what others are dealing with, and then it fosters an ability for us to all emulate their leadership that they show. So I'm almost to the end, and then we'll open up for questions. I feel like I'm running a little long, so I'll try to speed this up. We've had some of our most informative and engaging conversations in 2020. We did have a great conversation in April on Judaism and Islam that were quite powerful. We were very thankful to Josh Jeffries, which is our Jewish chaplain, and then Walid Elias, which is our Muslim chaplain. They were able to help us walk through some very difficult, challenging topics. We talked about Judaism in week 1, and then we went to anti-Semitism in week 2. We talked in week 3 of April, we talked about Islam, I should say, and then we talked about Islamophobia in week 4. Now, one of the things we try to do with intersections is to be very flexible in what we do, and we had some racist and xenophobic acts happen on campus, so we adjusted our focus to those events and what we could do. And so we quickly shifted, and we encouraged attendees to come and voice their opinions and concerns. Attendees really open up, they express their sorrow, their ignorance, their fears, and their concerns, and then we really, what was interesting, there was a lot of folks who admitted they were just blind to some of the injustices that had been happening. Another discussion group led by students, focused on students, tackled these same events. Lauren Stinson, pictured here, young African-American woman, was a first-year student when I met her. She developed a discussion series for students on campus called Inner Point, or A Call to Conversation. She and Emma Johnson established Inner Point to create a forum to give students the opportunity to talk about things like the current racial climate on campus. She met with Dr. Tina Cade, one of our colleagues on campus, who's Associate Vice President for Student Development, who had attended intersections previously, and she told Lauren about me. Lauren reached out to me via email. We set up a time to talk, and then myself and several others were kind of an advisory council to help her get started. And as luck have it, timing is everything again. They were supposed to launch in 2019, and they didn't. They finally found a date in 2020, right before we were going out on remote operations due to COVID-19. And just prior to that, we had a really horrific, we had the racist and xenophobic events happen. And so Interpoint was there just in time for these conversations with students. And what I found really, the students showed up when they called. It was an evening meeting, 7 p.m. I remember going, and I walked to the door. The line was 20 to 30 people deep outside the outer door, and there was a line going through the inner door, and it was probably 5 to 6 students wide. And so the students were having a conversation for students. Although I attended just for the beginning, they kicked all of the faculty and staff out. It was just the students for students, and I was really proud of the work she's done. We also, this year, all of us are aware of this story. I won't belabor the point, but a lot of these things hit home for me. As a black man living in America, I'm reminded that although I have worked hard to be where I'm at today, I'm still a black man in America. And when I walk off this campus, I'm no longer the vice president of anything. And at any time, I can find myself in situations where I could be negatively impacted, and I'll leave it there. We had a great discussion there, and then we have decided this year we're going to read the following book. I've shared 17 other books that were on our wish list, and then we voted on, and we picked this one. So what's next? Here's our topics. I'm going to try to challenge our group to start thinking about bringing in more diverse perspectives. There are times we feel like we can be an echo chamber of similar beliefs. And I really want to start challenging us, bring somebody that has that counter belief in, because I think that's where the rub happens. It's all fine and dandy to have a conversation with like-minded individuals or people who are really trying to grow and develop and understand the same way that you are. But when you leave the confines of intersections and you interface with folks in the world, you're going to run into folks that don't think like you. And how do you handle those situations? So I want to start bringing those inside intersections. And one of the ways I was thinking about doing is doing scenarios and possibly saying role-playing and taking a person who is an anti what you're thinking. Today we had today we had a conversation led by Allison, and so now, even though we are in a virtual world, we still keep it going, and she talked to us about LGBTQIA+, and hopefully our journey will help you and start or participate in a cross conversation at FAU. I apologize that I went too long, about 10 minutes longer than I expected, but I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have.
We do have a couple questions we'll get to, but I do want to make a reminder, if you have any questions you'd like to ask Keith, you can use the Q&A box on the bottom right of the screen. You can type those in, and then we'll make sure to get those by Keith. There was, Keith, a question asking about a list of all the suggested books and films mentioned throughout your presentation. We are planning to send an email to all the attendees with a survey. I can work with you to get that list, and we can include those in there if that works with you.
That'd be fine.
Perfect.
Love to do that.
So RJ, before you launch into the questions, I just want to thank Keith for going into this detail. I know you did not go on too long, and I can tell you didn't go on too long because nobody left the session. So we had almost the maximum number of registrants who stayed on throughout the entire time. So that tells me people were very much engaged. And I found this incredibly inspiring. And now I'll shut up and let other people participate.
Thank you for that, Carol.
There were a couple affirmations. Someone mentioned working with Dr. Atkins also, and saying that she was a phenomenal person. Someone commented on the movie.
Those must be Richmond people that showed up.
I think someone mentioned working UVA.
Oh, okay. Great.
There's a question here. Could we also get copies of the topic lists from the previous years? They screen capped one of them, but they'd like all of them. So Keith, if you could share those with me. I will also, this presentation is being recorded. It will be available on our YouTube page. It takes a couple hours for YouTube to process that. It is also available on our Facebook page. Both of those are at FAU Libraries, where you can see a recording of this presentation, but we will also make sure to send those out.
Yeah, we'd be happy to do that, RJ. Actually, something, I gave a brief summary of what we have, and so what I'd be happy to do is we have, for our logistics, we have a box folder where we have our basically our agenda for the whole year. We'll just send that stuff to you, and you can share it with the FAU community.
Perfect. That would be fantastic. There is a question here about moving online. Has moving online affected the dynamic from the face-to-face discussions?
Yes and no. I think in one way, it's actually enhanced it because folks who couldn't make it to the meeting physically seem to be able, something that Carol and I were talking about, they could now come to the meeting, right? So for example, our presidential spouse, Dr. Betty Neal Crutcher's got a really busy schedule. Sometimes she's in transit quite a bit. She can't make it. She's been able to attend more regularly to that. I think it's actually worked. It's, when we convened a conversation about the 3 murders that happened recently in the Black community, and we had 150 plus people show up to that was challenging because you had a lot of, I wouldn't say noise. You have a lot of people who want to say something, so you can't really read the room, and it's hard to, go one at a time and not have people interrupt. And then you have a lot of conversation going inside the chat at the same time. So, I've learned from that. So we need to have somebody that helps monitor the chat, and you have somebody that can call on the room, and then one person can just facilitate. And so you just learn from it. It's challenging in a different way, but I think we've worked through the dynamics. Let me add one other thing. I think it would be, because this is, and I don't know if I would want to start intersections in a remote environment. That could be challenging, but
okay.
I'll just leave that.
We do have a couple other questions that are coming in, so I want to thank everyone for submitting them. Please feel free. Keith has made some time available here at the end, so definitely get those questions submitted. Someone has a question. What suggestions do you have for speaking about issues regarding racism or oppression within administration or institutional policy, particularly for people who feel vulnerable as employees or students?
Wow, that's a deep question.
Yeah.
So my first thought is to, I'll shape it like this. I think know and understand what the policies are first on campus where you are. Because I found even here I've had folks who've kind of asked me something similar, and I know what the policies are here, and I've asked them a question, and I could tell they didn't know the policy. I would start small. I would say make sure you know what you want to talk about and why, and then be very professional and try your best to raise the question to the responsible or accountable office or person. I think there's also something to be said if you are an army of one to try to find others who are like-minded or similarly impacted, and I think there's power in a community speaking with one voice to raise issues up to administration. But I think, engage with a dialogue and not demand. That's just my style. I know there's folks who might want to come with a demand, but I think engaging in a dialogue, a respectful dialogue, but I think coming prepared, knowing what the facts are, and then helping folks understand the challenge of what's actually going on, and then offering up a couple ideas as a path forward. It is challenging to say to somebody just drops a problem in my lap and says, you need to fix this. You brought it to me. What do you think we need to do? What's wrong? So those are, hopefully that helps hopefully that helps.
Okay. Do you feel ableism would be a topic that could be discussed as well?
Absolutely can, and it should be. Ableism absolutely can, and it should be. We haven't tackled that yet, but I think it will be on our to-do list, just like we had ageism. And that was definitely something that I wanted to have a conversation because I'm now moving into that, the latter years of my career. Ableism, I think back when I was at my last institution, and we have one here too. We had a student that was blind, and I was amazed by the limitations I shouldn't say the limitation, I was amazed by the obstacles that they have to overcome to do what they do to navigate being at our institution, but how well and how able they are to do things, right? And I think absolutely ableism should be discussed. If I understand the question correctly, yes.
Yep, no, that was great. This one I feel is kind of like an interview question for you, but I think it definitely gets to the experience doing this. Could you share a specific difficult topic of the discussions and how you handled it to a good resolution?
Wow. Well, I'm going to share two quick stories. I'm going to share a story where I didn't do it well, me personally, and then I'm going to share a story that I think gets to what you're saying. So the first story, and I guess it's something I should share with folks, that realize that these topics are very, I don't want to say they're taboo, but they're just stuff that folks are just not used to talking about, and it makes us very uncomfortable. And I learned from a colleague at Ithaca College, Dr. Belisa Gonzalez. She used to share with this phrase that folks need to get comfortable with the uncomfortable. But I do know that our tolerance level for comfort is different. And so we've had folks who have come to intersections and then they're out. This is not my thing. I can't do it. It's too much for me. We've had people that have said that similar thing, but then over time come back. And then we've had new people join. And I distinctly recall a conversation and where I was talking about the rules of engagement, and I violated the rules of engagement because we were talking about a similar situation. You know, we were talking about police brutality in the African American community, and the conversation moved quickly through ideology, whether that's left or right or conservative or liberal, and there was a lot of emotion in the room, to include myself. And I responded in a way that right after I responded, I immediately regretted it. And I actually had to write an email to, and it was one of my staff. I wrote an email to them, then I went over to their office and met with them, and I apologized for my words and my actions. And I think we have a great relationship since, but that person's not been back to a conversation since then either. But again, we have a good relationship. I think about the conversation we just had, and I was in a virtual environment. We had 150 plus people, and we were talking about now the chat session was getting really live, but I think and I knew it was going to get to be a hot topic. I try to purposely frame and separate, and this is where the facilitator, I think if you have to plan it out. If you think the topic is going to get really, really controversial, plan it out and kind of think about the boundaries you want to have. So I wanted to make sure I separate the cases of Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, and Ahmaud Arbery to be separate, and we would talk about them separately, and then spend the time talking about what happened. Then move to talk about protests, because that's a whole nother conversation. And then move to riots, because riots is a whole nother conversation. They're not the same as protests. And have those, they're connected, but they're distinct enough. And I think it was just a way to help organize the conversation in a way that it didn't get out of hand. I think we were successful with that.
Okay. I have a question here about beginning and institutional support. It seems that there was university leadership buy-in for this program from the start. How did that support come to be? And does Intersections have a budget to do the high-level programming it is committed to?
Well, I'm a very direct shooter. I'm a VP. I convened the meeting. I didn't ask anybody's permission. We just started having these conversations at lunchtime. I invited the speakers who happened to be nearby. All of them, except for one, was free. They came and said they would have it. So really the only commitment was scheduling the room and a small fee that I paid for one of our speakers to come. Trying to make sure I addressed everything in their question. The commitment, once the word got out that I was doing it, I will say that my cabinet colleagues were very supportive of me, and they would push it and share it with their within their divisions or their schools. So it grew organically, and I outside of now Melody would know these numbers better than I would, but we paid for a speaker and we bought books for people. And I think for Dawnland, we had to pay for Dawnland. And I think all told, we might be under $2,000 over 3 years, 2,500 in 3 years, out of my budget.
Okay. I just want to share there's several people commenting. Thank you so much for this conversation. Several people commenting that they found the presentation very insightful and eye-opening as we go through here. I think trying to see if I skipped any questions.
RJ, I think I saw
Yep.
one that you skipped about library collections.
Oh, yeah. So there's several people from the library staff that are on here, and there was a question that it was up at the top. I think you're right. Talking about how, let me see, what was it? How do you discern that a library's collection or even part of a library's collection is diverse and inclusive?
How would that's a difficult question. I would look at the population. I would really ask your community, right? As I hear the question, my mind goes to I'm one person, and the diversity of the books in a library would be from the perspective of the entire community.
Mm-hmm.
My thought is, what do you have, and share that with the community and ask them, and then ask the community what is missing, what needs to be included. You know, and they may not have specific books, but they can have, like, you should have something about this. Like, for example, today, you know, our concluding conversation for Pride Month, we actually were talking about LGBTQ issues in Pride Month. We did our final discussion day because we had to reschedule because of another event. We were talking about violence, and you know, Allison Johnson led us through a fantastic conversation, and there was so much that I thought I knew that I did not know, and I'm thinking I got to go do some more research, and where would I go do that, right? So what are the topics? What's happening in the community? And when I think about LGBTQ, you know, what really was enlightening to me, she was talking about the violence within the community in addition to the violence from the outside to the community. And I was thinking, well, where do I go to find information about such things like that? And that's just one example. I talked about, you know, learning about Native American. Where is that being raised up? What's the history of the land that your institution's on? The people that are there? Things of that nature.
Okay. I have another question, kind of organizational structure. Person finds the approach from the ground up and evolving organically very inspiring. Universities often tend to set up committees and task forces. What would you say is key to sustaining an initiative like this?
Wow. I think the key, I figured I was going to get a question about this, and I'm struggling to answer. I think when we started this, I had no clue we would still be doing this 3 years later. I had no clue. And what I found is, I think there's a group of people who have an interest in this topic. I mean, this conversation wouldn't go just because I convene it. It keeps going because folks want to come and folks want to participate. And I would imagine that you have like-minded individuals at Florida Atlantic University or wherever you may be listening. And I think that's what keeps it going. And I'm going to be committed here as long as folks want to have the conversation. And I think we should keep bringing in. And as we grew and evolved, we started as a division. Then we brought in staff from outside our division. Then we brought in faculty, and then we opened up and allowed students. And so the mix is always different. And with that mix, you always have new blood, new energy, new topics of discussion. And we also have, it just seems like, and since Charlottesville to now, there's been a lot to talk about. So I think folks both are curious and interested in leaning in, and I think the world has given us a lot to talk about at the same time. So it's my thoughts. I also think too, and I should say this because I was thinking about it this morning. The University of Richmond has been on an inclusive journey long before I got here, and I think we are at a point now where what we started here is in the context of what was happening at the university already. So I think we had already kind of set up a platform where this could flourish. I don't know how well this would have flourished in a different era, and I'm not talking maybe, let's go 10 years ago, 15 years ago, I don't know. But I think where we are right now, and you saw a lot of that when I was talking about it in the presentation, there was a lot of serendipity there, there was a lot of just great timing, and I think there's a lot of opportunity that just seemed to converge, right? I mean, here's another small example. I could do this, and for us to be successful, I need a person who's behind the scenes who's taking care of a lot of logistics, and Melody does a fantastic job. But Melody is also deeply interested in these topics. So she has a passion just as much as I do. So I'm fortunate to have an assistant that leans in like I do to these topics, right? And so I could not have that, and it could be much more challenging, right? So there's just a lot of things that have gone well here, and I think there are people who are interested, and they are committed to showing up, because I think the value of the conversation and the richness of the conversation is bringing all the diverse thoughts and ideas from everybody and putting it on the table and having that vigorous, robust conversation.
Okay. That is all the questions that I came across. So I do just, before we close, a reminder, this presentation is being archived. It'll be archived on our YouTube channel and our Facebook page at FAU Libraries. Also, Keith, just want to put out a reminder about the free film presentation you mentioned during your presentation tonight at 7. The URL for that, if anyone didn't see it, was tinyurl.com/July 8 dawn. And with that, Carol.
So I just wanted to thank you, Keith, for this amazing presentation and the journey that you've been on. I've found it personally so inspiring, and I think that one answer that I would give to the question that was just asked is you need to have, exactly like you said about Melody, that passion. You need to have a core group of people who are passionate and are willing to lean in and engage. And what I really, really like about this is that it is not top down, and it doesn't presume that only faculty can have something to say, or only students can have something to say, or only people of color can have something to say. I like how from the very beginning, the get-go, it was intentionally inclusive. It started with your division, but then as it expanded, anyone could come and participate. And so that's something that I really value from what you've talked about. So I want to thank you again for your time here. And I know that if people could applaud, they would be applauding.
Well, thank you so much. It was an honor for me to be here with you today. It's the first time I've really shared about intersections outside the University of Richmond. So thank you for the opportunity, and I hope in some small way it's helped inspire you and help get started with similar conversations there. Thank you, guys. Appreciate it.
All right, then. Thank you, everyone. And we'll be getting information out to the people who registered. And I hope to be talking with many of you again soon in the future about this.